We would like to send out a special thanks to Native for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Native makes safe, simple, effective products that people use in the bathroom every day with trusted ingredients and trusted performance. For 20% off your first purchase, please visit nativedeodorant.com and enter the promo code COLD during checkout. That's nativedeodorant.com and the promo code is COLD. Thank you and enjoy the show. April 9th, 1947. Woodward, Oklahoma. 4-year-old Joan Gay Croft is taken to the local hospital after an F5 tornado wipes out her hometown and kills over 100 people, including her mother. While Joan Gay and her half-sister are recovering from injuries in the basement, 2 men show up and take Joan Gay away, claiming that they are taking her to another hospital to see her family. But Joan Gay is never seen again, and these 2 men are never identified. Over the next several decades, there would be a number of promising leads, including an anonymous emailer claiming to be Joan Gay, but she is never found, and the circumstances of her disappearance remain shrouded in mystery. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be traveling back over 70 years to cover a very unique unsolved mystery, the 1947 disappearance of 4-year-old Joan Gay Croft. Yes, cases involving missing children are not easy to cover, but the circumstances of this one are just so bizarre that I've been anxious to do an episode about it for quite some time. This story is technically a tragedy within a tragedy, as it involves one of the worst tornadoes in history, which completely devastated a small town in Oklahoma and caused the deaths of over 100 people, including the victim's mother. But the truly weird part is that Joan Gay went missing after the tornado as she was recovering from an injury in the basement of the town's hospital before 2 men came in and took her away, and then subsequently vanished within the chaos. What's interesting is that when they first arrived, the men specifically asked for Joan Gay, but didn't show any interest in her half-sister, who was recovering from injuries alongside her. If this was a planned abduction, it seems pretty brazen to do something like that in full view of several witnesses during the aftermath of an F5 tornado. A number of different theories have been pushed forward in an attempt to explain this disappearance, and we're going to try and explore all of them on today's episode. As a disclaimer, I should also mention that since this is an older case, I did run into the issue of different sources providing contradictory information about certain details, so if there are any instances where I'm not sure which version is the correct one, I'll try to acknowledge it. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearance of Joan Gay Croft. Our story begins in 1947 in Woodward, Oklahoma, a small town of just under 5,500 people. Our central figure is 4-year-old Joan Gay Croft, who lives with her parents, Olin and Cleta Croft. Joan Gay also has an older half-sister named Geraldine, who goes by the name Jerry, and is Cleda's daughter from a previous marriage. Now, the Unsolved Mystery segment about this case states that Jerry was 12 years old, while other sources say she was 8, which I think is the correct age, but I can't be 100% sure. Anyway, Olin is a very successful sheep rancher, and while the Crofts are not overly wealthy, they are considered to be one of the most prominent families in Woodward. On April the 9th, the country was on its third day of a national telephone operator strike, which would last a total of 5 weeks, and Cleda herself was an operator. While this was taking place, only emergency operators would be allowed to operate the nation's switchboards, and just 2 of them were on duty in Woodward. This meant that the town was essentially cut off from communicating with the outside world, so unfortunately, they were oblivious to the fact that they were now directly in the path of an F5 tornado. Earlier that day, a supercell thunderstorm near Amarillo, Texas, spawned 6 separate tornadoes, the worst of which was an F5, which measured almost 2 miles wide and wreaked havoc for nearly 150 miles across 3 different states. It would completely decimate a couple of small farming towns in Texas, including Glazer, in which there were 16 casualties, and Higgins, where a total of 45 people were killed. However, the tornado wound up doing the most damage in Oklahoma, and to this day, it is still considered to be the worst storm in the history of the state. At around 8 p.m., the tornado destroyed the farming town of Gage, causing the deaths of 8 people, and it was around this point that the emergency operators in Woodward were finally informed about the impending storm. But by this point, it was too late to warn everybody. The town's residents would later describe the sky as becoming ominously dark before the tornado finally arrived at 8:43 p.m. Even though it only took around 5 minutes to pass through, it traveled at wind speeds ranging from between 225 to 440 miles per hour and completely ravaged Woodward, flattening over 100 city blocks. A number of homes and businesses were destroyed, and a local high school student wound up surviving the ordeal because he happened to be in the bathtub at the time. Even though the storm lifted his entire house into the air, the bathtub's plumbing kept it secured to the ground. The winds were so strong that they managed to lift up a 20-ton steel boiler tank from the town's power plant and propelled it a full block and a half. Moments before he was killed, one of the plant's workers, Erwin Walker, managed to throw the master switch and cut off the town's power, an heroic act which likely saved a number of lives. The bark was completely ripped off a number of trees, and hundreds of chickens had their feathers stripped away. The storm would finally dissipate after it moved into Kansas, but in total, it caused the deaths of 181 people, 107 of them from the Woodward area, and nearly 1,000 people were injured. Today, it ranks as the 6th deadliest tornado in the history of the United States. Unfortunately, one of the fatalities was Cleda Croft, who was instantly killed when the storm hit the family's home and caused the side of the house to fall onto her. Olin Croft was left critically injured, while the 2 children suffered relatively minor injuries. Jerry received some bruises, while Joan Gay's left calf was pierced by a pencil-sized splinter of wood, which went right through her leg. While their father received medical attention, the 2 children were taken to Woodward Memorial Hospital by a neighbor. By this point, the town was in complete chaos because this was the lone hospital and it was only equipped with 28 beds. The bodies of a number of deceased victims were collected and placed on the hospital's lawn, and the nearby Baker Hotel would be converted into a hospital in order to treat those with less serious injuries. Cots were set up inside the hospital's basement as it was converted into a rescue shelter, so after they arrived, Joan Gay and Jerry were taken down there to receive treatment for their injuries. The girls' aunt, Ruth Croft, eventually showed up at the hospital with her daughter. Ruth was married to Olin's brother and was trying to locate the Croft family, as well as her own mother and brother. After she learned that Joan Gay and Jerry were receiving treatment in the basement, Ruth went down to see the girls and assured them that their father was going to be all right, though she did not tell them that their mother was dead, for fear that it would traumatize them. Ruth then went back outside and finally located her own brother and mother. Since her mother was injured and the Woodward Hospital was overwhelmed, Ruth took her to another hospital in Moreland, 10 miles away. While there, she would volunteer to help tend to the other injured victims, which would keep her occupied overnight. When morning hit, Ruth returned to Woodward Memorial Hospital, but when she went down into the basement, she was surprised to discover that Joan Gay was no longer there, and Jerry would provide a very troubling story. Sometime during the night, two men dressed in what was described as military-type khaki clothing came down into the basement. Some sources state that they asked for the Croft children, while others say they specifically asked for Joan Gay. When they found Joan Gay, the men proceeded to pick her up. She objected because she did not want to leave her sister, but one of the men assured her that they would return for Jerry later on. When a nurse confronted the men, they told her they were taking Joan Gay to another hospital in Oklahoma City to see her family. The staff seemed to believe this explanation, so the two men were allowed to leave with Joan Gay, but this would turn out to be the last time she was ever seen. A number of calls were made to hospitals in Oklahoma City and the surrounding area, but there was no success at locating Joan Gay. Following the aftermath of the tornado, it turned out that there were 3 victims in Woodward who could not be identified, and they all happened to be young girls. One of them was approximately 12 years old, the second was a small infant who was only a couple months old, but the third victim was a blonde girl who appeared to be around 3 to 4 years old and had a resemblance to Joan Gay. The town's mortician asked Ruth Croft to come down to the funeral home to look at the deceased child and bring some of Joan Gay's clothing along. When Ruth saw the victim, she was 100% certain it was not Joan Gay, and the mortician confirmed that Joan Gay's clothes were too big for her. Apparently, some local residents were able to identify the child as a girl who came from a broken home where her parents had separated and she was now being raised by her grandmother. However, the grandmother refused to make a positive identification or claim the body, so the girl would have to be buried as an unidentified child. It was theorized that the parents of the 12-year-old girl and the infant may have been transients or so destitute that they could not afford to pay for the child's burial and never came forward to identify them. Hundreds of school teachers from Woodward and the surrounding area visited the morgue to look at the 12-year-old and even brought their enrollment books along to jog their memories, but none of them seemed to have any idea who the girl was. The 3 children were never identified, and they would be buried in Woodward's Elmwood Cemetery. Since no trace of Joan Gay could be found, many law enforcement agencies were brought in to perform an official missing persons investigation. When her father, Olin, finally recovered from his injuries, he went out of his way to generate publicity for Joan Gay, posting up missing persons flyers and appearing on local radio stations. Since Olin was one of the wealthier residents of Woodward, it was theorized that Joan Gay may have been the victim of a ransom kidnapping, but no ransom demands were ever sent. Since the 2 men in the basement had asked for Joan Gay by name, investigators explored the possibility that someone from Cleta's side of the family might have taken her, but many family members were extensively questioned, and there was nothing to indicate they were involved. Olin soon remarried and moved to San Antonio, Texas, where he had 2 more children. He would reportedly spend the next several decades pursuing any lead he could find in an attempt to locate Joan Gay, before he passed away in 1986 at the age of 81. Over the years, a number of adult women would come forward, believing they might be Joan Gay, but for one reason or another, they were always ruled out. In September of 1993, the case would be featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and the segment managed to generate over 200 phone calls to the show's telecenter. The most promising call came from the daughter-in-law of a woman named Jean Smith, who lived in Phoenix, Arizona. Jean would have been around Joan Gay's age at this time, but she said she didn't seem to have any memories of her childhood before the age of 6. Growing up, Jean was struck by the fact that she did not resemble anyone else in her family and began to question if the people who raised her were actually her parents. At one point, she took her birth certificate and baby photos of herself to the Phoenix police, and it was determined that the footprints on the birth certificate did not belong to Jean, and the child in the photographs was not actually her. Jean would be diagnosed with psychogenic amnesia and decided to undergo hypnosis with a psychoanalyst. She claimed that she started having flashbacks to people she did not recognize, screaming at places she could not recall, so she started wondering if they were repressed memories of the Woodward tornado. It turned out that Jean had the same blood type as Joan Gay, as well as a scar on her left calf, in the approximate spot where Joan Gay had been pierced by a splinter of wood during the tornado. Olin Croft's sister and her family decided to travel to Phoenix and stay with Jean for 2 weeks, and they came away 100% convinced that she was Joan Gay. The producers of Unsolved Mysteries agreed to pay for DNA testing, but the results conclusively determined that Jean Smith was not Joan Gay Croft. But there would be another interesting development involving a columnist named Robert E. Lee. Lee was the former news editor for the Woodward County Journal and published several anniversary articles about Joan Gay's disappearance, and he would even continue to write about her after moving to Oklahoma City to write for their newspaper, The Oklahoman. On April 12, 1999, Lee received an email which stated, quote, "I know that you have written many articles about the 1947 Woodward tornado and about the missing Joan Gay Croft. How would you like to write an article about what really happened to Joan Gay and where she has been this past 54 years? She has been and is living in Oklahoma City off and on since 1956 under a different name with the full knowledge of her father, Orlin Croft. She even graduated from an Oklahoma City high school under her different name." End quote. The writer then provided an email address for Joan Gay and signed off with the name Miss Joan Gay Croft. At the time, the Oklahoman did not have the technology to trace an email address, so Lee wrote back asking for more information and received a reply a few weeks later. This time, the emailer said, quote, "I know this time of year there are many people who crawl out of the woodwork claiming to be the lost girl, but I was never physically lost. My immediate families knew where I was, I just didn't know who I was. Until just lately, I never faced the fact that Cleta Croft, my mother, died upon me. I buried this information deep within my long-term memory and refused to accept." End quote. This person hoped to arrange a public face-to-face meeting with Lee at the Penn Square Mall in order to share the full story. They concluded by saying, quote, "As to compensation, I would prefer none," and once again signed the email, Joan Gay Croft. Lee replied again to express his interest in a public meeting, and even mentioned that his own wife had also survived the Woodward tornado. But after this, Lee never heard from the emailer again, and after a point, the email address they provided stopped accepting messages. Joan Gay's surviving relatives have since provided their DNA to be entered into a massive state database in hopes that a match might turn up someday. If Joan Gay is still alive right now, she would be 77 years old, but there's still no answers about what actually happened to her. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Native, for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Our podcast often presents scary stories which might cause you to break out into a sweat, so it's handy to have Native deodorant around. Native makes safe, simple, effective products that people use in the bathroom every day with trusted ingredients and trusted performance. Native can hang with you in any situation, whether it be your workout, your busy mom life, or a 16-hour day. It has fewer, simpler ingredients, so you always know everything that's in the deodorant, and it is also safe and effective. It comes in a wide variety of enticing scents for both men and women, plus they release new limited edition seasonal scents throughout the year, and I can tell you that my producer/editor McGill and his wife both used the pumpkin spice latte scent last month for Halloween. But their other classic deodorant scents include coconut and vanilla, their most popular scent, lavender and rose, eucalyptus and mint, and my personal favorite, cucumber and mint. In addition, they also offer an unscented formula and baking soda-free formula for those with sensitivities. Native also offers free returns and exchanges in the USA, and if you subscribe to them, you can save 17% and $2 per stick and have them conveniently delivered to your door every 1, 2, 3, or 4 months. Like I just mentioned, I love the Cucumber and Mint brand because, well, it makes me feel as cool as a cucumber and smells great. I think it's very important to use a deodorant with clean ingredients which don't run the risk of providing potential health issues, and this is something which Native always guarantees. This is just one reason it currently has over 7,000 5-star reviews, and why it's been featured on The Today Show, Women's Health, Elle, Good Morning America, Pop Sugar, Nylon, Hello Giggles, and many more. So to get 20% off your first purchase of Native by visiting nativedeodorant.com and entering the promo code COLD during checkout. That's 20% off your first purchase by going to nativedeodorant.com and entering the promo code COLD. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the episode. Now, it's definitely not uncommon for people to go missing after large-scale disasters, but this case is pretty unique in that the victim survived the disaster itself, but went missing after an apparent abduction during the aftermath. This is a bit reminiscent of a case I covered on the podcast 2 years ago about the disappearance of 13-year-old Lee Ochi, who went missing during Hurricane Andrew in 1992, but the key difference is that she was an obvious victim of foul play in her own home, and the hurricane was just a backdrop for the story, rather than a key component. Here, Joan Gay Croft went missing from a location she never would have been at if the tornado had not taken place. I guess the closest comparison you can make is to the disappearance of Snea Phillip, who went missing after she was last seen in Manhattan on September the 10th, 2001, and it's always been up for debate whether or not she was killed during the attacks on 9/11. Now, when you're talking about cases in which very young children vanished and there were no obvious signs of foul play, it's inevitable that you're going to have a number of adults come forward over the years and believe that they are the missing child. Interestingly enough, a year before Joan Gay's case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, they produced a Lost Love segment about a woman named Mary Jane Medlin. In June of 1947, a badly beaten girl was found in a field in Weed, California, and taken to the hospital. Since she could not be identified at first, she became known as Little Miss X, and there was some speculation that she might have been Joan Gay Croft. But of course, she was soon identified as Mary Jane Medlin, and it turned out that her mother's boyfriend had beaten her and abandoned her in the field. When Unsolved Mysteries did their own segment about Joan Gay's case, the most promising lead came from Gene Smith, who seemed like a very promising candidate to be Joan Gay until she was ruled out by DNA testing. It sounds like Gene Smith's case might be a compelling story within a story, since there did seem to be convincing evidence to suggest that the couple who raised her were not actually her parents, but regardless, she was definitely not Joan Gay. I also read some articles from 1998, which stated that a woman from Canada also came forward who believed she might be Joan Gay. She apparently claimed that her family once had personal belongings and photographs bearing the names of Joan Gay's parents, Olin and Cleta Croft, which made her suspect that not only was she kidnapped, but that her so-called family had taken the opportunity to loot the Crofts' home following the tornado. But I could not find any follow-up to that story, so I can only assume that it was conclusively proven, possibly via DNA testing, that this woman was not Joan Gay. You probably know that I sometimes love covering older cases on The Trail Went Cold, because it's fascinating to explore just how different the world was several decades ago. Quite simply, many of the cold cases of yesteryear would not have happened with today's technology. Today, if a small town like Woodward, Oklahoma was in the path of an F5 tornado, there would be so many resources available to give them advance warning in order to prepare for it. But this was 1947, and there just happened to be a nationwide telephone operator strike going on at the time, so the residents of Woodward were completely oblivious about what was going to transpire. I read that in order to assist with the emergency rescue efforts following the tornado, 8 telephone operators decided to return to work while the strike was still going on, and they wound up being dismissed by their union. But I think the fact that no one in Woodward anticipated this storm was going to transpire is a very important detail in this story, and makes you wonder about the potential motives of the two men who took Joan Gay from the hospital basement. Had these guys been planning to abduct her before the tornado arrived, or were they just opportunists who decided to take advantage of the situation? On one hand, a dangerous, chaotic environment in which there are several witnesses is not the ideal circumstances in which to abduct a child without being seen. But on the other hand, the chaos caused so many distractions that it was feasible to just snatch a child right under everyone's noses and get away with it. I mean, we had the hospital staff flat out ask these two men why they were taking Joan Gay out of the basement, and when they said they were taking her to another hospital to see her family, they just took these guys at their word and let them go. I mean, you can criticize staff for not doing more to stop these guys, but in fairness, the nurses were dealing with a million other things at that time, so you can see how Joan Gay might have slipped through the cracks. So let's delve into potential theories about why Joan Gay was taken. We're now going to make a connection to another story which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and that involves Georgia Tan, a child trafficker who ran an illegal adoption agency in Memphis called the Tennessee Children's Home Society during this time period. Over the course of her life, Tan was believed to have been responsible for having stolen over 5,000 children, many from impoverished families, and using her agency to adopt them out to wealthy out-of-state families at high prices. I have no idea if Tan ever stole any children from Oklahoma, and I seriously doubt that she has any personal involvement in this case, but it's possible that Joan Gay could have been the victim of another child trafficking ring just like Tan's. They decided to take advantage of the chaos in Woodward to abduct a young child who was not in the company of her parents and illegally adopted her out to another family. However, the two men who entered the hospital basement apparently asked for Joan Gay by name, which seems to indicate that they knew who she was, and Joan Gay would be quite an unusual target for an illegal adoption ring. The reason Georgia Tan abducted children from poor families is because they did not have the money or resources to fight back, but the Crofts were one of the most prominent families in Woodward and would definitely not have taken things lying down if they knew Joan Gay was being adopted out. Of course, since Olin Croft had money, another theory which has been pushed forward is that Joan Gay's abduction was a ransom kidnapping. It's possible that these men had been planning to kidnap Joan Gay for some time, and it's just a weird coincidence that the town was hit by an F5 tornado right before they made their move. Well, unless they were watching the family the entire time, it's unclear how the kidnappers could have known that Joan Gay was in the hospital basement, and this begs another question. How could they even be certain that anyone from her family was still alive in order to pay a ransom? Remember, Olin was left critically injured by the tornado, and his wife was killed instantly. At this point, I don't think anyone could have been 100% certain that Olin was going to pull through, and in fact, some newspaper articles published following the tornado mistakenly listed Olin Croft's name among the deceased victims. And let's not forget that Olin's house was destroyed, and that the entire town had just been obliterated. Even if Olin was alive and well, it probably wouldn't have been easy for him to just put together a large amount of money to pay off a ransom under these circumstances, especially in the technology-deprived world of 1947. The biggest argument against the ransom kidnapping theory is that no ransom demand was ever sent, but there could be an explanation for that. When the tornado hit, a pencil-sized wood splinter pierced Joan Gay's left calf and went all the way through her leg. Accounts seem to differ about how thoroughly this wound was treated, but if she was removed from the hospital before she received the proper medical attention, it's possible she could have developed some sort of fatal infection while in the custody of the people who took her. If Joan Gay died before the kidnappers could make a ransom demand, then perhaps they disposed of her body without ever contacting her family. But again, what are the odds that someone would have attempted to commit a kidnapping for profit following the aftermath of a natural disaster they could not have anticipated? Now, I mentioned earlier that the two men asked for Joan Gay when they entered the basement, but accounts are different about whether they specifically used Joan Gay's name or if they asked for the Croft children. But either way, it's clear that these men did not seem to have any interest in her half-sister, Jerry. I know there was speculation that someone from Cleta Croft's side of the family may have taken Joan Gay, though no evidence was ever found to support this. I really don't think that theory makes much sense, since Jerry was Cleta's child from a previous marriage, so I'm not sure why they would be compelled to take Joan Gay and completely ignore Jerry. The most disturbing theory behind Joan Gay's disappearance is that these two men were pedophiles who later murdered Joan Gay after they had their way with her. I know that Joan Gay's family have referred to her as a quote-unquote uncommonly beautiful child, so perhaps there were a pair of sexual predators from the area who always had their eye on her and decided to take advantage of the situation since they knew Joan Gay had been separated from her family. Again, they asked for Joan Gay by name, so they clearly knew who she was. All that being said, even though you can't accuse pedophiles of being rational people, it still seems incredibly brazen to survive a devastating F5 tornado which took the lives of over 100 people, and then decide that this would be an ideal time to abduct a child. Regardless of what their motives may have been, how could these guys have been so certain they would be able to get away with it without being stopped? If this was an abduction with criminal intent, then they just got incredibly lucky that the nurse who stopped them believed their explanation that they were taking Joan Gay to another hospital. I would say there's a good chance that the two men were not from the immediate area. Woodward was considered to be one of those small towns where everyone knew each other, and there were so many people both in and outside the hospital that you'd think that someone would have recognized these guys if they lived there. Another frustrating element of this case is the vague description of what the men were wearing, which has usually been described as quote-unquote military-type khaki clothing. Since both of them were wearing this clothing, it's possible they were affiliated with the military or may have been rescue workers. But if that's the case, this doesn't explain why they would take Joan Gay out of the hospital while leaving Jerry behind. Let's suppose that they were actually telling the truth and planning to take Joan Gay to another hospital to see her family. Who would have sent them there to begin with? It's true that Joan Gay's Aunt Ruth was at a hospital in Moorland with her family that night, but since Ruth was the one who discovered Joan Gay was missing, she obviously knew nothing about these men. Now, some sources state that Olin Croft's injuries were so severe that he was transported to a hospital in Oklahoma City, 150 miles away, and that the two men specifically mentioned Oklahoma City after they grabbed Joan Gay. It would actually make sense to take Joan Gay there, and this also might account for why they didn't grab Jerry, since she was technically not Olin's biological daughter. If these men were good Samaritans who were legitimately attempting to reunite Joan Gay with her family, perhaps something happened to them on the way there. They could have accidentally driven into a body of water, and the three of them are still submerged inside a vehicle somewhere after all these years. But here is another issue with contradictory information from different sources. A few months after the tornado, Olin was interviewed for an article in the Daily Oklahoman and stated, quote, "I was still unconscious under the rubble of our house when the children were taken to the Woodward Hospital. Later, I was taken to the same hospital, but I was removed about daylight to the Baker Hospital." End quote. Now, as a refresher, the Baker Hospital is a reference to the nearby Baker Hotel, which was converted into a hospital in order to accommodate the many injured patients. But if Olin's quote is correct, then this means he was treated at the Woodward Hospital at the exact same time Joan Gay was there and never went to Oklahoma City, so there doesn't seem to be any reason to take his daughter to a different hospital. But if that did happen, there is another alternate theory which was proposed during the initial media coverage of the case. What if Joan Gay got lost in the shuffle because of a clerical error? Joan Gay actually spoke with a lisp, and since she was only 4 years old, some people put forward the idea that she was taken to a hospital, but she was unable to give her name correctly, or they simply misunderstood her, and for this reason, she was listed under the wrong name. When they couldn't match Joan Gay up with her family, and no one came forward to claim her, she wound up being placed in foster care and was raised under a different name somewhere. This scenario might sound absurd today, but again, we're talking about rural Oklahoma in the pre-digital world of 1947, following the worst tornado in the state's history. Information just simply didn't travel as fast back then, so even though Joan Gay's disappearance did generate a lot of publicity at the time, it's not impossible that she slipped under the radar. But of course, this still doesn't explain why these so-called Good Samaritans would remove Joan Gay from the hospital to begin with and separate her from her half-sister. So now we have to talk about the intriguing mystery within a mystery, and that's the 3 girls who were killed by the tornado and never officially identified. I know that one of these girls resembled Joan Gay and appeared to be her age, which is why her Aunt Ruth was asked to identify her. I briefly considered the possibility that perhaps this deceased girl was Joan Gay, and possibly due to wishful thinking that her niece was still alive, Ruth was simply mistaken when she said the victim was not her. However, it does seem that other residents of Woodward were pretty certain they knew who this girl was, but her grandmother just refused to identify her, and since she was never claimed, they had to bury her as an unidentified child. Yeah, that sounds incredibly sad, but the world was still decades away from DNA testing, and this child was probably still too young to have dental records by that point. If the grandmother refused to make a positive ID, how could they conclusively prove that the child belonged to her family? If this theory about the girl's identity is correct, then it definitely rules out the possibility of her being Joan Gay, but even if she was, that still wouldn't explain how she was killed after she was removed from the hospital. I'm not sure they ever released the exact cause of death for the child, but it sounds like it was due to the circumstances of the tornado, and there were no obvious signs of foul play. It sounds like the deceased infant may have been in a similar situation, where her impoverished family refused to claim her because they couldn't afford the cost of a funeral or a burial, or her parents were just killed by the tornado, and they were unable to match them together. It does seem strange that no one from Woodward or the surrounding area had any idea who the 12-year-old girl was. I know that a bunch of school teachers looked at her body and could not identify her, so maybe she also hailed from an impoverished family who never sent her to school and would not come forward to claim her body. Whatever the case, all 3 of these victims are still buried in Elmwood Cemetery, so if they have the resources, it would be nice if the authorities were able to exhume them for DNA testing. Even if they're not connected to Joan Gay's case, these girls deserve to have their names back. So we'll now move on to the final piece of the puzzle in this case. The emails received by newspaper columnist Robert E. Lee in 1999 from a woman claiming to be Joan Gay. She claimed that she was still alive and well after all these years, living under a different name, and that her late father had always been aware of this. She was hoping to organize a face-to-face meeting with Lee to explain the whole story, but stopped communicating with them before this could take place. They were unable to trace her email address, but in her last communication with Lee, she wrote, quote, "I am on the internet on most MWF, which I'm assuming is Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, between 9 and 10:30 a.m., end quote. So I wonder if that means she did not have internet at home and was sending these emails from a public place, like a library. Now, in her second email, she specifically wrote, "My immediate families knew where I was," and the word family had an S on the end, surrounded with brackets. However, this was just over 5 years removed from her aunt and cousin appearing on Unsolved Mysteries to search for her, so they obviously did not know where she was. So when she said immediate family, was she only referring to her father and half-sister, Jerry? Well, interestingly enough, Jerry did not appear on Unsolved Mysteries, and when Gene Smith came forward following the show, Jerry apparently declined a request to submit a DNA sample for testing. The only time I've ever seen Jerry speak publicly about Joan Gay's disappearance was when she responded to an anniversary article about the case during the 1970s and stated, quote, "Granted, it would be more than a joy if Joan Gay was found through one of the stories, but the chance is less than 1 million, end quote. Well, I know that when Olin Croft recovered from his injuries following the tornado, he went out of his way to generate publicity for his missing daughter, but looking at his memorial page on the Find a Grave website, I was surprised to discover that he got remarried in the summer of 1947. That's only a few months after his wife was killed, and he moved to San Antonio the following year. I know that different people grieve in different ways, but Olin seemed to move on pretty quickly after losing his wife and daughter, though perhaps he felt he had to get away from Woodward because his house was destroyed, and it might have been too painful for him to remain there. Interestingly, the Find a Grave website also states that Olin, quote, had little contact with his Croft siblings following his move to San Antonio, so I don't know if I should read anything into that. But I've seen sources which state that Olin continued pursuing leads to find Joan Gay up until his death, which, if true, goes against the emailer's claims that she was living under a different name with her father's full knowledge. Again, this tornado was a completely unpredictable event which no one could have anticipated, and it left Olin incapacitated, so I just don't see how he could have orchestrated his daughter's disappearance, or why he would be content to let her go on living somewhere under a different identity. It's also interesting how the emailer misspelled Olin Croft's name as Orlin with an R, which could be a sign that she's lying, or it could just be a simple typo. However, what's particularly odd is that when she signed her name at the end of both emails, she spelled Gay with an E on the end. There are no other sources out there which spell Joan Gay's name with an E, but if you do some online sleuthing under Joan Gay Croft with an E, you'll make some interesting discoveries. There's an old Twitter account for a Joan Gay Croft which has the handle JJ Croft Constein, and the only tweet on the account, from way back in May of 2011, reads, quote, "Posted my case, years in the making, hope family understands," end quote, which sounds pretty cryptic. Well, I'm guessing this might be in reference to a legal appeal you can find online from December of 2010, where the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit looked at the case Constein versus United States. Believe it or not, the plaintiff, Virginia K. Constein, had sued the United States Department of Education, the Student Loan Association, and 4 Department of Education officials, and the case was heard in front of the United States District Court for the Western District of Oklahoma. The reason the suit was filed was because the government had reduced Constein's Social Security disability checks to make payment on her student loans, so she asked for, quote-unquote, relief from the defendant in the amount of $34 trillion. I know this will probably come as a great shock to you, but the suit was dismissed, and Miss Constein did not receive her $34 trillion. But what's interesting is that the appeal states that in May of 2010, the Attorney General of the United States received a certified mail delivery of a motion for default, and it contained a return address label with the name Joan Gay Croft with an E. Now, for all we know, this nonsense may not have anything to do with the case, but the emailer who told Robert E. Lee she was Joan Gay Croft claimed she had been living in Oklahoma City under a different name. And here, we have a woman from Oklahoma City named Virginia K. Constein who has apparently been using Joan Gay Croft as a false name. So I do have to wonder if this Constein was the one who sent the email. Because if she's crazy enough to file a lawsuit for $34 trillion, then she also might be the type of person who would pretend to be a girl who went missing over 50 years ago. The fact that Joan Gay just happened to misspell her own name in her emails makes me inclined to believe that the whole thing was some sort of bizarre hoax. But the problem is that it's so difficult to figure out what really did happen to Joan Gay. I hate to say this, but I really can't come up with a concrete theory to explain the whole situation because it is just so out of the ordinary. I would really like to think that whoever abducted Joan Gay did not go on to kill her, and that she somehow got placed with another family and went on to live a long time under a new identity without any awareness of who she really was. At 4 years old, she still would have been young enough to have forgotten all memories of life with her original family, and even if she did remember her mother and father, she may have been told they died in the tornado. If she is still alive today, Joan Gay would have turned 77 years old on October the 28th, just over 1 week before this episode's release. However, there's always the possibility that she went on to live a long time under a different name, but has since died of natural causes. Since her surviving family's DNA is in the state database, there's always a possibility of a match someday. So if by chance you happen to have any information on the unsolved disappearance of Joan Gay Croft, or if you think you might even be Joan Gay, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released a spooky Halloween-themed episode about the Ghost Blimp, the baffling story of 2 Navy pilots who vanished without a trace from a blimp while it was in mid-flight during World War II. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Jen M, Taylor D, Bree K, Lisa M, Justin K, and Whale Biscuit. Thank you all so much for your support. And one more announcement. This past summer, we held a live watch together party in which myself and several of my listeners viewed a marathon of unsolved mystery segments which featured cases that were covered on The Trail Went Cold. Well, the whole event was a blast, so we're going to be holding another one this coming Saturday, November the 9th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you go to our Facebook or Twitter pages, you'll find a link at the top of the pages, which takes you to our official screening room on SciTube. So be sure to click on the link this coming Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time and join us for our Unsolved Mysteries Marathon. Hope to see you there. Also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. And I also want to give a plug to the website lostandfoundblogs.com, where my friend Crystal Dawn has published an article about the Joan Gay Croft case. I previously mentioned this blog on my episode about the disappearance of Clifford Sherwood, as it features a number of extensive articles about missing persons cases from Unsolved Mysteries, which often contain exclusive information you won't find anywhere else. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join me next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.